Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple red wiggler bins that need to be fed. I've got 3 bins with red wigglers in them. One of them is my newest one, right down here on the floor. And that bin is, at this point, it's only 4 weeks old, 28 days of age. So far it's received 6 feedings, and the second oldest one is over here. And this one was a little bit damp, if I remember correctly. It's now at the age of 71 days. It's already received 10 feedings. And the last one that I've got is up here on the top shelf, which is now at the age of 103 days. And the last feeding, which was its 13th feeding, was the one that I deemed to be its last feeding. So I've decided that this one is kind of going into a foraging mode at this point, giving the worms a chance to break down the contents of the bin, any sort of scraps of food or bedding that might still be in there. I thought we might check in on it, just to see how that last feeding 7 days ago is holding up, and just to see how the general condition of the bin is. And then we'll go ahead and we'll feed the other 2 bins. So why don't we get these things up onto the bench and get to work. The feeding that they're getting, as you can see, is a nice assortment and a pretty plentiful quantity of different types of veggie scraps and skins of peels of banana, you name it, a whole bunch of different stuff piled into each of these trays. Each bin that I'm feeding is going to get a tray's worth of food. I've also got some grit. I don't think grit was applied during the last feeding, or the last couple feedings for that matter, so I'm going to give them grit on this go around. And another staple item that they often get is coffee. This thing is almost full of coffee. And I've also got some used coffee filters over here that we could use as bedding. All right, let's get to work. All right, so even though we're not feeding this bin today, we're going to check in on how this oldest bin is doing. Like I said, it's foraging, and by that I just mean the worms have plenty of food from the previous feedings and just from leftovers that remain in the bin from past feedings. So I'm letting them really work that stuff down, and I was even trying to give the bin a chance to dry out a little bit too, because it seemed like it might have been excessively damp in here. But at some point I probably will cover it up with plastic again, which is the way I usually like to leave it, because the plastic encourages the worms to spend time up on the surface of the material too, not just down in the moist bed. But the reason it was drying off was because I did feel that it was a little bit more damp than it needs to be. Since it's only been a week since the last feeding, we're probably still going to find some scraps in here. The feeding that was applied to these red wiggler bins a week ago was prepped a little bit differently than usual. I took a little extra time in prepping the food by steaming it to try to soften it up, to make it all a lot easier for the worms to consume. I guess what I'm feeling down here too on the bottom is different types of scraps. These feel like they're maybe leaves. Yeah, we had a number of autumn leaves thrown in here, and I tried to move them to the bottom of the feeding area to try to encourage the worms to break that stuff down. I really wanted this stuff to be mixed in along with the food. But as long as the worms are eating all kinds of fresh kitchen scraps and easy to eat foods that have been steamed and softened for them, I'm sure it'll be a little while before they turn their attention to these sticks and stems of the leaves. So I think we've still got quite a ways to go. I think it's going to be some time before this bin starts to resemble a finished compost tub, especially with a lot of this more tough material in here that needs to get broken down. And I still see a fair number of scraps from the previous feeding remaining in here too. I think these are potato. It'll all go in time. Some people talk about how potato takes some time to eventually break down. It takes them a little bit longer to eventually eat it up. But I think that if this bin keeps going for a while with no fresh feedings, it'll just be inevitable that the worms will have to start turning their attention to just anything in the bin that they can consume. So even though the center is where the last feeding was positioned. I believe that another good place to find worms, besides just where the most recently added food was put, is out on the outskirts of the bin too, which is where I generally push all of the older food items. Just noticing so many little itsy bitsy little worms here. Little worms, all kinds of little tiny worms everywhere, which is a great sign. It's nice to see that they're expanding their numbers and reproducing. But before we close up shop here, I'm going to just do a quick little till around in the far edges of the bin over here. Over here, the material looks a lot more like just a bunch of finished castings here. Not a lot of food scraps, not a lot of bedding scraps. That's really what we want this stuff to look like. But since it's not all looking like this quite yet, since we've still got large chunks of stuff that needs to get broken down, since we've got a pretty high moisture content over in the middle area still, I think I will just continue to leave this bin covered with only paper the way we found it. And let it dry off a little bit more, at least for a little while, maybe another week or so. And then at some point I'll probably restore the plastic coverings to make sure that the top surface of the bin is also just as appealing for the worms to hang out on and to break the material down at as it is elsewhere in the bin. So let's also take a quick glance at how things look on the other side. I'm starting to wonder if I can just collect all of these larger chunks of leaves that I encountered along the way and kind of get them down into a deeper place before we close up shop here. So I am going to try to gather them all together and keep them together. And then I'll submerge them at the end. So let's just pile them up here for now. And let's see what we got happening over here. Here too, the material looks pretty nice. There's a little bit more scraps over here. Some fairly dry stuff over here too. Maybe not quite as many worms, but still the material looks pretty good over here too. Just a nice earthy smell. There's really no presence of any sort of unusual odors, just a nice fresh kind of earthy smell, like, you know, which is what you should normally expect to find in your worm bins. And for that matter, you know, I mean, I might really be just letting this go all the way to the point where I feel like the entire bin and its contents are nothing more than a bunch of finished castings before I get back to feeding this bin. And at that point, the feedings would be simply for the purposes of trying to coerce the worms out of the finished compost by maybe feeding on just one side of the bin, trying to lure them out of the material at that point. But for now, I think the whole bin has, you know, a pretty good amount of material scattered all throughout it that the worms can work on. And I'm even questioning whether I would want to leave it uncovered, because the moisture level, while it did seem a little bit high, it didn't seem excessive really. Even down here in the middle. Plenty of moisture, but I can't really say it's muddy or anything like that. So you know what? I'm going to double back on my original game plan here. I believe that rather than leaving this covered with only paper, I believe I am going to put plastic across the top at this point, just to try to lock in whatever moisture is in here right now. Just let it start recirculating within the bin, just to not let things get overly dry or uncomfortable for the worms. We'll have time later if we feel like we need to allow it to dry out more, but for now I think it is probably a good idea to try to lock in whatever moisture content this bin has right now and not allow it to dry out any further. So why don't we do that? I'm going to skip putting this feeding zone indicator on, because at this point we're not feeding anymore. We will put the this piece of paper across the top, but I'm going to get a piece of plastic to cover that up with as well. I really like these red color bags that I get from the big box store. They're just a slightly larger bag and a slightly better quality bag than you find in most vegetable markets or supermarkets. And it seems to do a really good job covering things up nice and thoroughly in these bins. All right, I think that's going to make for a really nice space for the worms to continue to work down the material in. And we'll check in again as time goes on, but for now I think we're in pretty good shape here. All right, let's proceed to feeding. All right, so now here too, I believe we had kind of a moisture situation, even though in the oldest bin now I don't think we've got a moisture situation anymore, so we've gone back to using plastic coverings. Here too, I think I had a little bit of a moisture situation going on, but I did opt to keep the plastic coverings on. And that was because I had added a whole bunch of dry paper into this bin. You can already see some of it over here. It's collected a lot of moisture. And my thought was that it would, that paper would actually collect a fair bit of the moisture that I thought was excessive within this bin and maybe help get things stabilized in here. So I didn't want to go too crazy. I wanted to just try one thing at a time, and since I did want to add a good bit of bedding and I figured I would put it in dry the way I did, I thought that alone would probably help counteract some of what I thought to be excessive moisture in the bin. So we'll see. We'll poke around here a little bit and try to figure out how things are progressing. You can tell that the worms are enjoying hanging out on this shredded paper. There's castings all over the place, worm castings all throughout it and on the paper. And I guess we'll know better once we get down in here. I think one of the other telltales we were noticing in these red wiggler bins, at least the more damp ones, was that we were seeing a lot of springtail activity. Those little itsy bitsy, almost invisible little insects that zip around all over the place within the bin. Usually a telltale that you've got maybe a little bit too much moisture going on. And I think just, looking really, really carefully, I do think I see a couple here and there, but nothing too crazy. Nothing to be too concerned about. Let's see how that feeding from last week is progressing in this bin. Pretty good bit of moisture right down where the food was added, which is usually the case as the food starts to break down. The moisture that is held within the food starts to make its way over into the bedding materials. Here too, you can see a good number of these old autumn leaves that had been thrown into the bin at one point that were most recently placed down low within the bin to try to use them as bedding around the feeding area are all still down here and pretty much intact. I'm going to try to keep those down low right around where the food's being added in the hopes that they too get consumed in the process. But other than the leaves, I don't really see any signs of the last feeding. The last feeding was mainly potato, I think. A lot of frozen potato that had then been steamed, so it had gone through the freezing process and then it went through the cooking process. So it's all kind of mushy and soft. So I think this is actually a piece of it right here. So we might actually be starting to come up on some of it over here, as you can see, but not too much. They've done a pretty good job doing away with the majority of it, which I'm glad to see. I'm glad to see it because I did want to add this entire amount of food that I had allocated for them, and it is a pretty good amount. So I didn't want to add it if it wasn't really needed. But usually when it's already down here, it's too late. It's going into the bins whether I want to add it or not. So let's see. We've made ourselves a pretty good gap that we could drop all that food into. I think it should fit pretty nicely. We should also then afterwards still also have enough material out here on the top to cover up with completely. So I'm just going to try to collect some of these leaves that we encountered along the way and get them back down here right under where the food's going to be. Because once the food starts to thaw out and starts to get eaten, all those yummy juices out of the food are going to make their way into these leaves and make the leaves just as tempting and delicious as the food itself. And I've also got some of these coffee filters here too, so why don't we go ahead and give these little guys a couple coffee filters as well. It's just good bedding, a whole bunch of it. And I'm sure they'll appreciate the fact that it's still got some coffee stuck to it. In the past, I had always gone out of my way to, you can even tell with this one that sat in the bin for the past week, clean out my coffee filters and set them all aside nice and neatly and stack them all up, and I got tons of them. But now that I've got this new type of coffee machine with this cone-shaped filter, these filters just don't last. They're kind of crimped together. Once they get wet, they start falling apart. They've just been coming straight into the bins lately, and I've not been collecting them whatsoever. All right, so I'm going to hang on to all this paper material that we found on the top surface. I'm going to keep that on the top for now. I thought at first that I might just use that as bedding to place down underneath the feeding area. But we found a whole bunch of leaves, and I had these coffee filters, so I think we're in good shape as far as bedding is concerned beneath the feeding. And then we'll still have that paper material out on top as a good top cover. So let's just go ahead and drop in this entire portion of food. I think just by looking at it, it looks like it could be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 times as much food as they received a week ago. It's a pretty generous feeding. Definitely an abundant amount of food. A lot of stuff you could tell that they're probably going to really enjoy too. All these banana peels. I think they really like these green leafy things as well. So I don't know what to expect here if we came back in here another week from now. Chances are a good part of it's probably going to be consumed, or at least I would hope so. Now before we proceed, we're going to sprinkle some of this crushed eggshell onto the food so that the worms can utilize it as grit. I don't think I've added grit to these bins in a while, so it seems like a timely thing at this point since it's been a while. And then, you know, here I go again. It's always like my trademark move to somehow always forget to add the coffee, right? I don't know why. Maybe I'm just a little bit absent-minded. This filter we can just save for the other bin that we're feeding. And let's start bringing things back. Alrighty. Start covering things up here, and also while we're at it, we'll take a little peek on the outer edges, see how things look. Pretty good worm population in here from what I can see. There seems to be worms all over the place. Having the plastic on seems to be working well. It does seem like this paper, by having been scattered across the top, did manage to absorb a good bit of the moisture that I thought was perhaps excessive in the bin previously. Because I don't feel like at this point that the bin is excessively damp. I figured if I had to, I could always, you know, take that next step of potentially removing that plastic covering and giving it a chance to air out a little bit. But I think the material in here is quite nice. It's got a good moisture level, but it's not muddy. It's not sticky and nasty. So I think we're going to be good continuing to cover up with the plastic in here. Let's take one more look over on this corner too to see how things look. Give it a little agitation while we're at it. Why not? These big sticks. Makes me wonder if these things are going to break down. Try to break it up a little bit, help it along. Alright, very nice. Definitely like the way things are looking in here. So not just the way we found it, I'm going to scatter all this paper across the top because it does seem like the worms really like to come up and hang out on this stuff. The stuff is collecting a lot of the moisture that would normally just evaporate out of the bin, but since the plastic is capturing it and keeping it in the bin, with it being right there under the plastic, it just becomes the spot that all the moisture collects on. And it just seems to drive the worms crazy. They really enjoy hanging out here in this stuff. You know, in time they'll also eventually consume this stuff as well. But at some point we might just decide to use this stuff as bedding under the feeding as well. But for now I think we've got a good abundance of leftover leaves that serve that purpose nicely for now. Okay, we'll go back to marking where we just fed using our feeding zone indicator, which in my worm bin is traditionally one of these circular shaped coffee filters. And then we can get to covering things back up over here. Okay. Every now and then I just can't seem to resist using my clean hand. It's the hand that I try to keep clean so I can manipulate the camera with it without making the camera all filthy. And back goes the plastic. Seems to be doing a good job, and we seem to have a really nice environment in this bin. Very nice. All right, on to the last bin that we've got to feed. All right, so if I'm not mistaken, this, the newest of my red regular bins, I think has a really good sized population in it. Possibly close to 3,000 worms, but I'm not 100% sure. Sometimes I am a little bit skeptical of my estimation methods. But in my tracking spreadsheet, I do try to keep track of the numbers that I've estimated, and that's the number that appears in my spreadsheet. Although a lot of the numbers that appear in my spreadsheet also have the question mark symbol next to them, just showing my uncertainty in whether those numbers are accurate or not. We've got a good number of worms coming up to enjoy the moisture collecting on this piece of paper here. We'll see if we can convince them to skedaddle while we add more food to the bin. Sorry guys, hate to disrupt your little party here. Just need to gain access to your environment for a moment so we can add some fresh food. This bin also, all of these bins received the same style of feeding last week. It was food that had been placed into a steamer and left to get nice and soft and mushy before being placed into the bin. Prior to that, it had actually been in the freezer. And as we saw in the last bin, a good portion of it has already been consumed, and I'm assuming that that's probably what we're gonna find here too. We'd been using this piece of cardboard as our feeding zone indicator, and you can see that the worms are doing a number on it. They're really tattering the edges, ripping into it, even punching holes through it. So it's held up quite nicely for the longest time, but it's really almost history. Even this last lower layer, the one that was facing down, you can see the corrugated layer right past it because the layer that was facing down has been nibbled away in large part as well. So it's just interesting to see how they eventually do away with cardboard. It doesn't happen right away, but they definitely do away with it over time. All right. I'm wondering if we should just use this cardboard as bedding under the feeding area and replace the feeding zone indicator function that it served with this this recycled filter that we've got from the first bin that we had it in previously. Wow, I can almost tell right away when I stick my fingers down into the feeding area of one of my bins that I'm pretty much putting my fingers through nothing but worms. And that's the feeling I get when I put my fingers down into here. There's just this slightly different kind of feel to it. And look at all those castings. Considering how young this bin is, it's remarkable how many castings I'm finding right down through the middle area there. So it's really a fast-paced bin. Man, look at all these worms in here. They're just making mincemeat out of this food that was down in the middle area. Because the other thing is that besides the worms that you're running your fingers through, the other stuff that you're running your fingers through is pretty much finished castings too, which is really kind of light and fluffy and airy, especially when it's occupied with this many worms. So yeah, this bin just has some incredible potential. The pace at which it's able to break down food based on its massive population is pretty remarkable. Sometimes I even question whether my estimate of 2,800 could just be even shy of the actual numbers. Because when you look at how many worms are in here, it's just incredible. Look at them all. Damn. It's a good thing we bought a nice plentiful bunch of food down here. It almost seems like this bin could have easily been fed twice as much as the other bins got, and it would have probably done away with it in just as much time, or maybe even less time, than the other bins. So that's quite impressive, I must say. I feel like I want more bedding in here. I feel like the food that we're going to give them is fairly plentiful. But instead of just dumping it down in the hole, I feel like I would like to have some bedding down there. So you know what? I'm definitely going to go ahead with that original idea there, which is to recycle this piece of fairly tattered cardboard and simply place it down into the feeding area as bedding for them. But I've also got some shredded paper, which I think we could use too. Oh yeah, not to mention this, this filter over here as well. So let's rip this into little pieces as bedding too. And then before we place the food in, I guess I can grab a handful of that shredded paper as well. And I think that's going to complement this feeding quite nicely. Because the bedding is food as well, if you think about it. I'm just going to go with one handful like this. It's a pretty good amount. It looks more than it is. It's just, you know, mostly air. It's just strips of paper. I'll push them down into the hole a little bit so they don't occupy as much space. And then we can proceed with giving these little guys some food. Here again, I've got pretty much the same amount that the last bin received. Like I said, making me wonder if it's enough to sustain this many worms. Because as we were pulling stuff out, I definitely found things like, you know, a leftover banana stem right there. This is all bedding. I thought I saw, like right here, might be a piece of leftover potato. So there are little bits and pieces remaining from the last feeding, just not much. But I'm glad that they didn't completely deplete what they got last time. Here's the stem of something. But they're doing just an incredible job down in here. So I think I even mentioned last week when we fed these guys that, you know, this is going to be a fun bin. Every time you come into a bin with this many worms in it, you know you're going to be in for a treat. Pretty new bin. It's only 4 weeks old at this point, so I always feel good about giving these newer bins a good amount of grit, just to make sure that the worms have it if they need it. And then we'll finish off with what remains of this coffee. Alright, seems like a pretty nice feeding for them. Here's all these worms that we pulled out a moment ago, so now we get to see them again as we try to return them back over the feeding area. So many nice castings mingled in with them as well. Awesome bin. I'm always curious. I always want to see how things are progressing out on the edges of my bins as well. So let's take a peek. Here we're seeing a lot of the material that made the bin up originally. Leaves. I guess for a 4-week-old bin, it's not too surprising. I would think that some of these things, like these stems of vegetables, are also parts of what was originally placed in here as their initial feeding of when the bin was built. You've also got stuff like this avocado seed, which is a pretty hard, tough object. Still too tough to be broken, but in time it'll soften up and it'll break. Take a peek over on this corner too. Yeah, lots of leftover bedding out here on these far outer edges. Seems like the feeding area is drawing a lot of attention and a lot of worm activity. It almost seems like they're neglecting these outer corners of the bin. That's okay. There's always a lot of time here to catch up. We're only a month into this bin, not even. So there'll be plenty of time for all this stuff on the outskirts to get broken down too. Plenty of bedding, you know, plenty of bedding mixed in with plenty of castings too, you know. It's not just bedding, it's got castings scattered all throughout it, so it's clearly a place where the worms have been spending time. And, you know, breaking that stuff down as well. But just in the sheer numbers, you're not seeing quite as many out there as we saw right down the middle. Right down the middle is where we've got the big party going on. Alright, so that's pretty much all we had for today. Before we cover up, let's put the traditional feeding zone indicator in place to show us where we last fed. Some people ask me if I ever feed elsewhere. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I'll try that pocket feeding approach where the food gets positioned at the different locations throughout the bin each time. But more recently I've just been keeping it really simple and placing all the food right down the middle. But I also do it in a way that when I do make room for the new food, I push things out, so each previous feeding gets pushed out further and further. So, you know, if you consider right on the outskirts of where the feeding was applied would be like the leftovers from last week's feeding. A little further out would be the leftovers from the feeding prior to that. And that always seems to work pretty well for me. So, as long as it's working well for me, I'll tend to just stick to it. This bin's a little bit wider, as you can tell. Even though this plastic's pretty good sized, it doesn't quite make it all the way out to the edges of this bin. So this bin does get a little bit of additional airflow on these two edges. A little bit more than those narrow bins that we fed or checked in on in the first two bins. Alright, very nice. I got a little bit of cleaning up to do here, obviously, and I'll put everything away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. I'll just leave it at that. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.